The disorientation faded slowly, replaced by a creeping awareness of my situation. I stood in a narrow alley between two insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that housed most of Rome's population. The walls were cracked plaster over brick, stained with soot and moisture. Laundry hung from wooden poles jutting from upper windows. The ground beneath my feet was packed earth mixed with refuse I didn't want to examine too closely. My modern clothes drew stares. A tunic and sandals would have been unremarkable, but my jeans and t-shirt marked me as foreign, strange, possibly dangerous. People gave me a wide berth, their eyes suspicious or hostile. A child pointed at me and said something to his mother. She pulled him away quickly, shooting me a look that needed no translation. I needed to blend in, but I had no idea how to get Roman clothes without money or the ability to ask for them. More urgently, I needed to understand where and when I was. I walked toward the noise, toward what I hoped was the Forum. The streets were narrower than I'd imagined, barely wide enough for two carts to pass. The buildings loomed overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of cooking fires, human waste, animal dung, rotting garbage, and the acrid tang of tanning leather. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to breathe through my mouth and keep moving. Voices surrounded me, rapid, harsh, incomprehensible. I caught fragments, individual words I recognized from my studies, but they flew past too quickly to grasp. A merchant shouted what might have been prices. Two men argued about something, their gestures aggressive. A woman called out. To her children? To a customer? I had no idea. The isolation was crushing. I was surrounded by thousands of people and I couldn't communicate with any of them. I couldn't ask for directions. I couldn't ask for help. I couldn't even ask where to find food or water. I was functionally deaf and mute, and the realization made my chest tight with panic. The Forum opened before me like a revelation. Massive temples with columns that seemed to touch the sky. The Basilica Julia, where legal cases were argued. The Rostra, where speakers addressed crowds. And everywhere people, thousands of them, moving, talking, trading, arguing. The noise was deafening, a wall of incomprehensible sound that pressed against me from all sides. I found a quiet corner near the Temple of Saturn and sat on the steps trying to think. My hands were still shaking. I needed to establish when I was. The architecture gave me clues. The Forum was fully developed, which meant after Augustus. The Colosseum would have been completed, which meant after 80 CE, but I needed more precision. Listening to conversations, I picked out Emperor Trajan. That narrowed it down. Trajan ruled from 98 to 117 CE. I was in the early 2nd century, probably around 100 CE, based on the prosperity I saw around me. Rome at its peak. This was both good and bad. Good because the empire was stable, wealthy, and at peace. Bad because I was 2,000 years from home, with no way back, no resources except the knowledge in my head, and no way to communicate that knowledge to anyone. I sat there for what might have been an hour, watching people move through the Forum, listening to conversations I couldn't understand, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. My partner was 2,000 years in the future. My family would never know what happened to me. I was completely, utterly alone. The grief threatened to overwhelm me again. I forced it down. I couldn't afford to break down here, in public, surrounded by strangers who might see weakness as opportunity. I had to focus on survival. Grief was a luxury for later, if there was a later. I forced myself to think systematically. What did I need to survive the next 24 hours? Water. I was already thirsty, and the Roman summer heat was intense. I knew about the aqueducts, the public fountains, but I also knew about waterborne diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid. The Romans didn't boil their water. They didn't understand germ theory. Drinking from a public fountain could kill me within days. Food. My stomach was empty, but I had no money. Roman currency was bronze, silver and gold coins, asses, denarii, aurii. I had none of them. I would need to find food somehow, but I also needed to be careful. Food poisoning was common. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat. Vegetables could be contaminated with human waste used as fertilizer. Shelter. I couldn't sleep on the streets. Rome was relatively safe during the day, but at night the narrow alleys became dangerous. Thieves, gangs, and worse prowled the darkness. I was vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced. No police to call, no hospitals if I got injured, no antibiotics if I got infected. A simple cut could become septic, a broken bone could cripple me permanently. I stood and started walking, looking for solutions I could find without words. Near the Forum, I found public fountains fed by the aqueducts. The water looked clear, but I knew appearances meant nothing. I would need to boil it, which meant I needed fire and a container. I found a market area where vendors sold food: bread, olives, cheese, dried fish, fresh vegetables. The bread looked safe enough if it was freshly baked. The heat would have killed most pathogens, but I had no money to buy it. I watched how people interacted, how transactions worked. Coins changed hands, goods were weighed on balance scales. Prices were negotiated, rapid exchanges I couldn't follow, gestures I couldn't interpret. The economy was sophisticated, but it ran on currency I didn't have and communication I couldn't manage. A vendor noticed me watching. He said something, a question, an offer, a warning, no idea. I shook my head and backed away. He frowned and turned to another customer, dismissing me. Worse than invisible, I was incomprehensible. A strange foreigner in odd clothes who couldn't speak, couldn't understand, couldn't participate in the most basic social interactions. The isolation was suffocating. I walked to the edges of the city, where the buildings gave way to workshops and industrial areas. Here, craftspeople worked: potters, blacksmiths, carpenters, canners. And here, there was waste. I moved carefully, trying not to draw attention. A few workers glanced at me, but most ignored me. I was just another scavenger picking through refuse. Rome had plenty of those. I found a pottery workshop where broken vessels were piled outside. I selected a large shard that could hold water, not perfect, but functional. I found scraps of wood that had been discarded, too small for construction but perfect for kindling. I found a piece of iron rod rusted and bent that could be straightened and sharpened into a basic tool. I also found food, not fresh but edible. Bread that was a day old, discarded because it had hardened. Vegetables that were bruised or wilted. Fruit that was overripe. None of it was appetizing, but it was calories, and I needed calories. A dog growled at me as I picked through a pile of refuse. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The dog was probably harmless, but I couldn't afford to get bitten. No rabies vaccine, no antibiotics. I carried my scavenged materials to a spot outside the city walls near the Tiber River. This area was less crowded, with open spaces where I could work without drawing attention. I found a sheltered spot against a wall, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. I was scavenging garbage to survive. I was hiding outside the city walls like a criminal or a beggar. This was my life now. I forced the thoughts away. I couldn't afford to spiral. I had to focus on the immediate task, making fire. I gathered stones and arranged them in a circle, a basic fire pit. I collected dry grass and small twigs for tinder. I found larger sticks for fuel. Then I faced my first real challenge, making fire. I knew the theory. Friction generates heat, sufficient heat ignites tinder, but theory and practice are different things. I tried the bow drill method, spinning a wooden spindle against a wooden base using a bow made from a bent stick and a cord. I'd seen it done in videos, read about it in survival guides. But actually doing it was brutally difficult. My hands blistered. The spindle kept slipping. The tinder smouldered but wouldn't catch. I worked for what felt like hours, my frustration growing. The sun was setting. I needed fire before dark. My hands were bleeding. My back ached from hunching over the fireboard. I wanted to scream, to throw the stupid spindle into the river, to give up. But I couldn't give up. Fire meant survival. Fire meant boiled water, cooked food, warmth, light, protection. I took a deep breath and tried again. Finally, after countless attempts, I saw smoke. Real smoke, not just dust. I blew gently on the ember, feeding it oxygen. The tinder caught. Flames appeared. I carefully added small twigs, then larger sticks. The fire grew. I sat back, exhausted but triumphant. I had fire. It was the first thing I'd created in this world, and it felt like a victory. A small victory, a tiny victory, but it was mine. With fire, I could purify water. I filled my pottery shard from the river. The water was murky and probably contaminated, but boiling would fix that. I balanced the shard on stones over the fire, careful not to crack it with thermal shock. The water heated slowly. I watched it carefully, waiting for bubbles. When it reached a rolling boil, I let it continue for several minutes, long enough to kill anything living in it. Chemical contaminants would have to wait. Right now, I just needed to avoid dysentery. I let the water cool, then drank. It tasted of smoke and clay, but it was safe. My thirst eased, I felt my body relax slightly, the tension of dehydration fading. For food, I had the scavenged bread and vegetables. The bread was hard, but I softened it by dipping it in the hot water. The vegetables I ate raw, They were past their prime, but not rotten. It wasn't a feast, but it was sustenance. My stomach cramped as I ate, too much, too fast, after a day of near starvation. I forced myself to slow down, to chew thoroughly, to let my body adjust. The food sat heavy in my gut, and for a moment I feared I would vomit it back up. I breathed slowly, deliberately, until the nausea passed. As I ate, I tried not to think about what I was doing, eating garbage, drinking river water, hiding outside the city walls like an animal. This was my life now. This was what I'd been reduced to. I thought about my apartment in 2025, the refrigerator full of food, the tap that provided clean water instantly, the bed with clean sheets, the door with a lock, the phone I could use to call for help if anything went wrong. All of it gone. All of it impossibly far away. I'd survived the first day, but barely. I needed a more sustainable approach. I needed tools, materials, and most importantly, I needed to figure out how to communicate. But how could I find someone patient enough to teach a desperate foreigner? First, I needed to make it through the night again, and right now, with my hands blistered and bleeding, my body aching from unaccustomed labor, and the reality of my situation pressing down on me, that seemed like challenge enough. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. The fire provided warmth and light, but I knew it would attract attention. I kept it small, just enough to ward off the chill and any animals that might wander by. I arranged my sleeping area carefully. I cleared the ground of stones and debris. I gathered dry grass and leaves to create a thin layer of insulation between me and the cold earth. I positioned myself with my back against the wall, where I could see anyone approaching. But I couldn't see much. The firelight created a small circle of visibility, maybe 3 meters across. Beyond that was darkness, complete, impenetrable darkness. No streetlights, no ambient glow from buildings, just blackness, and the sounds that came from it. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every sound made me alert. Footsteps, voices, the rustle of animals in the brush. I was acutely aware of my vulnerability. No locks, no walls, no weapons beyond a sharp stone I'd found. If someone wanted to rob or harm me, I had little defense. And I couldn't call for help. I couldn't shout for assistance in the language anyone would understand. I couldn't explain what was happening. I couldn't even scream effectively, because drawing attention might make things worse. My heart hammered at every shadow that moved beyond the firelight. When footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate, I froze, barely breathing. 2 men passed within 10 meters, their voices low and rough. They didn't see me, or perhaps they did, and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, my hands shook for an hour afterward, and I couldn't stop imagining what would have happened if they'd come closer. What if they'd been robbers? What if they'd been violent? What could I have done? How could I have defended myself? How could I have called for help? The cold seeped through my makeshift bedding. My hip ached where it pressed against the hard ground. My stomach cramped with hunger. The scavenged food had been barely enough. I shivered despite the fire, my body burning through calories to stay warm. I'd read about hypothermia, knew the signs, but experiencing the bone-deep chill was different from knowing about it. I thought about my bed at home, the mattress, The blankets, the thermostat I could adjust with a button, the locked door, the phone on the nightstand, the knowledge that if anything went wrong, I could call 911 and help would come. Here, there was no help. There was only me, and the darkness and the cold. Around midnight, I heard screaming from somewhere in the city. A woman's voice, high and terrified. Then silence. My imagination filled in the terrible possibilities. There was nothing I could do. No police to call. No way to help. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. My dreams, when they came, were confused fragments. My apartment in 2025, the forum. My girlfriend Sam's face, the fire pit. I woke, gasping, from a nightmare. From a dream where I was trying to explain quantum physics to a Roman soldier, but the words came out as gibberish and he drew his sword. The night stretched on forever. Each hour felt like 3. I fed the fire periodically, careful not to let it die, but also not to make it too large. I watched the stars wheel overhead, the same stars I'd seen from my apartment window, but somehow different here. Brighter, clearer, more indifferent. I thought about giving up, just walking into the city, finding a Roman official trying to explain somehow that I needed help. Maybe they'd take pity on me. Maybe they'd enslave me. Maybe they'd kill me as a vagrant or a spy. I thought about walking into the Tiber and letting the current take me. It would be quick, easier than this slow struggle for survival. But I didn't. I sat by my fire, shivering and exhausted, and I waited for dawn. But the night passed without incident, at least without incident to me. As dawn broke, I felt a mixture of relief and determination, but also a profound exhaustion that went beyond the physical. I'd survived 24 hours in ancient Rome. I'd found water, food, fire, and shelter of a sort. I'd proven I could apply knowledge to solve immediate problems. I stood, stretched my stiff muscles, and looked at the rising sun. My body protested every movement. My hands were raw, my feet blistered from walking in inadequate shoes, my throat scratchy from smoke and dehydration. Day 2 was beginning. The real work was about to start, and I was already exhausted.